Hello, CactusCon. Alex here again to introduce our final talk. MQTT, or Message Queuing Telemetry Transport. Tiny protocol, big vulnerabilities. Presented to us by Tracie Martin, who's a principal security engineer at a really big bookstore. Don't forget to stick around after the talk for a live Q&A. And after that, please hang out and stay for a while and enjoy our closing ceremonies. Appreciate you sticking with us and hope everyone had a really wonderful CactusCon. Take it away, Tracie.
Hello, CactusCon. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday to join me in this presentation on the Internet of Things, a protocol called MQTT, this tiny protocol with big vulnerabilities. A little bit about me. For those of you who are repeat CactusCon attendees, you may recognize me from last year, where I did an OSINT talk on nation-state grooming in social media. That is one of my many facets, I suppose. My newest skill set is in the Internet of Things. I'm a principal security engineer for a really big bookstore that you might have heard of. I've worked in security for about 20 years now, doing a bunch of different things. I was in the military for a while. I've worked at a couple different companies like Microsoft and Google, doing everything from incident response to product security. I have also started a conference up in Seattle that some of you may have been to. It's called DefendCon. You should check us out on Twitter. And hopefully, once this pandemic is under control, we'll all be back to doing in-person conferences again. I'm also a US Air Force veteran. I spent a lot of time, not just active duty, but doing work for the US Army, doing work for NATO. I spent about a third of my adult life overseas, doing counterintelligence work in Belgium. So I've done a lot of really random stuff. So you'll notice that my hobbies include OSINT. Someday I hope to get a full-time job doing just research and OSINT, but hasn't been in the cards for a while now. I also dabble in photography. That's my backup retirement job for when I burn out of IT. And then I spend a lot of time raising my small toddler who has decided to give up sleep for New Year. So we haven't slept in a really long time in my household. I'm told that gets better, but so far I'm not seeing it. Finally, really important disclaimer down at the bottom. You'll notice that I don't include my employer's name in here. Not that it's terribly difficult to find out, but it's very important that you know that the views expressed in this presentation are mine. They're not my employer's. If you find something that you disagree with or that you think is stupid, feel confident that you are disagreeing with me or you think I am stupid and not my employer. All right, let's get started. So first of all, what is the Internet of Things? I know we hear a lot about this concept. It's all over the news. If you're following any type of security talk, this will probably come up. Maybe you yourself are struggling with what types of devices you want in your home, what types of Internet of Things applications you have that will make your jobs and days easier. Uh, the Internet of Things is a really broad category. You can find everything from microcontrollers all the way up to what we would have considered fully fledged computers probably even 10 years ago, working in hospital situations like MRIs, pacemakers even, light bulbs in your home, baby monitors. The Internet of Things is really a huge variety of different types of devices. The idea, though, is that they are physical things that interact with the internet. So physical things meaning they're sensors, they're cameras, they're something you can put your hands on that do a function in the physical world. So the technology around this has been about $100 billion for 2017. That's a lot. If you have been around IT and computing, you'll see that this is very similar to the 90s dot-com era, where there's this technology seems to be proliferating like crazy. In fact, in 2025, they're estimating that it'll be around $1.6 trillion. So that's a lot of money, a lot of technology, and of course, if you are in security, you'll realize that anytime technology bounds ahead this quickly, there are bound to be security issues. All right, so what is MQTT? Message Queuing Telemetry Transport. It's basically a standard that they developed in order to facilitate communications with networks that don't always have guaranteed connectivity, guaranteed reliability. Maybe they have wonky bandwidth, low power, low energy devices that may come on and offline sporadically. It's designed for devices that have a small footprint. It's designed for applications where you're not always going to be able to connect to a server or connect to another machine even on the network. So its history is that it was designed to support oil rigs that were out at sea and had a requirement to communicate back to home base with things like the amount of oil they had been able to get, the manufacturing status of the devices on the rig, humidity, motion sensing, a bunch of different metrics that they needed to be pushed back to home base from these oil rigs that sat out in the middle of nowhere with very limited connectivity. There's not a lot of Wi-Fi hotspots out in the middle of the ocean. So they created MQTT so that if you were on a satellite link, like many of these were, and your connection was very lossy and you didn't have a lot of bandwidth, and there's a potential that you could be on and offline sporadically, all of these things were built into the way MQTT functioned. But what they didn't think about was security. And the reason is you can pretty much guarantee that if you're out in the middle of the ocean and you've managed to climb all the way up there on that oil rig, odds are pretty good you are authorized to be there, and any device that you put on the oil rig was at least put there by an authorized person, even if the device itself was not authorized. So MQTT was never really designed to have security, much like HTTP before it. It was designed to allow trusted parties to communicate. Well, now, obviously, the landscape has changed, so this presents a couple of challenges. So beyond the challenges, though, why would we use MQTT? If it wasn't built to have security, what makes it still a valuable protocol today? The cool thing about MQTT is it's very scalable. So it has a bunch of brokers that can fail over seamlessly. You don't have to designate one as primary and one as secondary. You don't have to mess with a lot of load balancers or traffic shapers. It just works. It's also packet agnostic, meaning whatever technology you have on the other end, as long as it will fit in the MQTT packet, you can shove that data in there and it'll be carried along just like a mail person is delivering packages. It's also really reliable. Unlike HTTP or even SMS that require both the server and the client to be online at the same time, MQTT allows the client to send a message and wait for the server to come back online and then validate that that message actually got received by the broker. Which means it doesn't depend on both of them being online at the same time. And you can imagine in these very far-flung industrial areas, the odds are you're going to have a situation where your broker or your client may be disconnected at the same time. So it's really important to have a communication protocol that isn't bound to that. It's also really efficient. It was designed to operate on microcontrollers and things that don't have a big code footprint, that don't have a lot of processing power, maybe don't even have a big battery. These devices are intended to stay out in the field sometimes for 10 years without being updated, to run on a single battery for 10 years. So this protocol had to have a very low overhead. So we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but just some key concepts to kind of put in the back of your brain. And don't worry, I have a bunch of scenarios and a bunch of graphics that I think will make this a little clearer. But just for now, let's get some vocabulary out of the way. So a publisher. A publisher, just like in other contexts, is somebody who sends a message. So if you think about this as the physical devices on your network, your light bulbs, your cameras, the welding equipment in industrial applications, cars. All of these things that want to say something to another thing are publishers. A broker sits in the middle of that, and you can have 1 to n brokers, so you can have multiple brokers that sit in the middle, and they take these messages and they sort of do like the old telephone switchboard operation where they go, okay, this is a message on the home light bulbs topic. Who's subscribed to that topic? And they forward it on to all the interested parties. And the subscriber is the person on the other end of that protocol that is interested in that topic. So that would be your smart home app, or maybe a manufacturing app for a car or a factory. And then topics are just categories of information. So if you can think of it almost like a file system, a better file system than mine, because my file system is always in disorganization. But for people who are really good at file systems, you have your root, and then under there maybe you have your movies, and then under that you have TV, and under that you have documents, and it's this bucket of things that people are interested in learning about. So let's do a really basic example. This is based on something that I did as one of my first IoT projects. Um, my cat, if any of you have had the misfortune of being on a web call with me, you have definitely seen her butt, because she is super obnoxious about being right up in my face all the time. And she cries about everything all the time. She's fine. We've taken her to the vet. She's just really noisy. That's kind of her thing. But the problem is, I often don't realize her water dish is out of water because she cries over everything, so it's really hard to figure out what she's specifically crying over. And her water dish sits in a back part of our home that I don't really go to a lot, mainly to keep it away from the toddler that I mentioned before. So I got an IR sensor that I put on an Arduino, and it basically just measures the distance from the top of her water bowl to the bottom. And if it hits water, great. If it goes below a certain distance, then it sends me an alert. So that's the publisher, right? The distance publisher. So you have sensors, and you can have, let's say, IR sensors, motion sensors. All of my sensors of all my different things would be in my sensors topic, and then the ones that measure distance would publish to sensors/distance. That message would go to the broker. The broker would look up, well, there's an app on Tracie's iPhone that's interested in knowing the distance between the top of the water dish and the bottom of the water dish. And it would send that message to the subscriber. And you'll notice there's a database at the bottom part of this. This is not technically part of the official MQTT spec, but it's almost always used in modern implementations of MQTT just as a way of storing and processing large volumes of message data. All right, so that was a really simple version of a home automation service with MQTT enabled. But what are some of the other use cases that MQTT exists in? We mentioned oil rigs. Not a lot of us will probably have a huge opportunity to interact with oil rigs, but I bet if you start to look, you'll start to notice that MQTT is kind of everywhere. It's weirdly ubiquitous for a protocol that not many people know about. So here are some use cases that are, I think, interesting. Many of you will have heard of connected cars. If you can imagine that you have a car that's driving around, maybe it's not in cellular service, it doesn't have Wi-Fi, it can't connect to a server, it goes into a parking garage. So MQTT is great because it doesn't require that car to be within a communications distance of any kind of service. So you can imagine that the car would be able to publish to topics like speed or fuel level or oil life. And there can be a subscriber like the app on my phone that predicts when my car will need maintenance, or sends these messages to my insurance broker to let them know that I drive like a mad person. And the reason MQTT is great is because traditional technology communication protocols like HTTP or SMS really fall apart if both client and server aren't online at the same time. MQTT doesn't have that problem. All right, home automation. This is probably the quintessential use case for all IoT, right? Your smart lights. Your smart lights maybe they publish to a topic like home lights. You want to know whether the light bulb is on or off. If you're really fancy, you want to know if your light bulb is red or blue or green. And your phone is the subscriber to that topic because it needs to know whether the light bulb is on or off so that it can also act as a publisher and send a message to your phone, to your light bulb that says, hey, you're off, I need you to turn on. All right, industrial IoT. Applications such as smart grid, manufacturing, car manufacturing, any kind of wind turbine factory. These are really common use cases for MQTT for a lot of the same reasons. Many of these devices are legacy devices. They operate on a small footprint. You're dealing with a heat sensor or a motion sensor or a wind turbine sensor that may have fractional computing power. So MQTT is a really good way to get these messages across. The cool thing is that it allows interconnected factories to predict maintenance issues. So if I am, let's say, measuring the vibration on a wind turbine, and suddenly the vibration goes up by 30%, I know that I should take that turbine offline for maintenance sooner rather than later before something goes terribly wrong and it breaks the turbine. It can also help when you're doing connected factories, because if you've ever seen I Love Lucy, where the factory backs up and everything is terrible, you can predict that in, the fourth process of manufacturing, something is broken. I want to go ahead and stop the entire factory line until I can fix that. All right, so we've learned about what MQTT is and what MQTT does. Now let's put on our security hat and talk about the types of attacks we worry about. So if any of you are old like me and you've been around IT for a while, a lot of these will probably seem really familiar to you because they're very reminiscent of sort of the early internet. Much like HTTP, MQTT was just not designed with security in mind, so we have a lot of the same problems with a few unique twists. So there's denial of service, there's poor auth N, there's poor auth Z, software vulnerabilities, and the overall transport security between the broker and the client. All right, so denial of service. This is a little bit different in MQTT. You can obviously have a more traditional denial of service attack where you just flood the network. But what's really interesting about MQTT is because the broker exists as a central point of failure, you can actually use a rogue client to consume all of the broker resources by just sending a ton of requests to the broker. If you can think about it, if you have 3 kids and one of them is constantly screaming at you, you're going to pay more attention to the kid that's screaming. So what happens is then the broker can't respond to authorized client requests. The other interesting thing is that MQTT is often designed to not allow 2 devices with the same client ID to connect to the same broker. And since client IDs are usually pretty easy to guess, they're usually based on serial number or a very sort of easily incremented default username, it can be really easy to spoof a client ID and bump actual authorized devices off the network. You can also try to just sort of spam the topic list. So let's say that you have an industrial IoT situation where the topic turn off the nuclear power reactor is active and only 2 or 3 things have access to that because obviously that's very sensitive. Well, if I just keep spamming that topic and saying, hey, I'd like to subscribe, hey, I'd like to subscribe, hey, I'd like to publish, hey, I'd like to publish, eventually I can overwhelm the MQTT broker just by trying to filter out all those bad requests. The other thing is MQTT, just like HTTP or any other protocol, can be vulnerable to malformed packets. Because of the way that it processes any kind of data, this can be really hard to detect and really hard to defend against. Poor authentication. So if you spin up an MQTT broker, most of the common ones don't require any authentication at all. If they do support it, you have to turn it on as a secondary feature, and it's usually username and password, which is sent in the clear. Username and client IDs are pretty easily guessable. It'll be like Phillips Hue, and then followed by the last 4 of its serial number, or IR sensor 1, IR sensor 2, IR sensor 3. things like that that are pretty easy to know or guess. And there's also this problem of default device certificates or repeated device certificates. In a perfect world, certificates are better than username and password, but if you give everybody the same username and password, that's not so good. Well, if you give everybody the same certificate, it's basically the same problem. And unfortunately, when you're manufacturing hundreds of thousands or even millions of devices, it can be a certificate nightmare to manage and distribute and revoke individual device certificates. So many manufacturers use one certificate for all of their devices. Poor authorization. So in a perfect world, you would set your publish and subscribe topics to only the devices that needed to publish or subscribe, right? I would only want my light bulbs to publish to the home light bulbs topic. I don't really want my light bulbs to publish to the home refrigerator turn off topic, right? That's not something that's useful and it shouldn't happen. But unfortunately, in a lot of MQTT instances, it's very easy to just say anybody can publish, anybody subscribe, and there's not a lot of great controls around device segregation. There's also a lot of support for wildcards, which is really great. For example, if I wanted to be able to subscribe to all the sensors in my home, I could just subscribe to home/sensors and then /pound rather than doing home/sensor/light bulbs, home/sensors/IR detect, home/sensor-motion. So it's a useful thing, but unfortunately it means that it can be really easy to enumerate topics over things that I shouldn't actually be able to publish or subscribe to. And then finally, software vulnerabilities. So MQTT, like any other software package, has vulnerabilities in it. We are now on MQTT version 5, but most places are still running MQTT version 3.x. And there's been a lot of vulnerabilities discovered in those application packages. And the problem is that many of these don't get updated. So you can think of something that's so central to your communications network that kind of sits out there and never gets updated, which causes a huge vulnerability when you figure that if you can control the broker, you can control the world. And then also device-side software vulnerabilities. So many of these devices are cheaply manufactured. They don't have good code quality. They're used from open source or other sort of semi-questionable repositories without understanding either how they work together or how they're actually implemented in the device. And then also a lot of devices don't have any actual device-side security. So those certificates that I mentioned earlier are often just stored in the file system without encryption, making it really easy to just grab that certificate and impersonate an authorized device. And it's almost impossible to tell the difference between that device with a stolen certificate and an authorized device with the exact same certificate. Transport security. So as I mentioned, MQTT doesn't natively support encryption. You can add it. You can do TLS, which is what many of the providers do now. But unfortunately, many of the devices are low compute, low bandwidth. So it becomes really challenging to do a fully featured cipher suite to make encryption that's worthwhile. And a lot of times the problem is they try to do lightweight implementations, and lightweight in crypto world is usually a pseudonym for less good. Not always, but oftentimes. And they also have something called insufficient entropy. If those of you who are smarter than me have done a lot more studying of cryptography, you'll notice that many of the cryptographic algorithms require a seed value. And depending on the randomness of your seed value, that can affect how cryptographically secure the actual certificate or encryption algorithm ends up being. So a lot of these manufacturers use their serial number, for example. And if my serial number is 123 and my next one is 1234, it becomes really easy to predict what that random value is, and then much easier to crack the encryption that goes along with it. So what's the problem? Well, a lot of MQTT instances are exposed on the World Wide Web. You can find them using pretty commonly known software like Shodan. And then you can connect to them and see what you can see. When I was a little girl, there used to be this song, A sailor went to sea to see what he could see. And oftentimes I feel like that when I'm doing any kind of scan on the internet or a sufficiently large segment of my private IP space. So it's kind of scary and terrifying and awful what you can find if you just kind of look. So here's what I found. I did this scan a couple months ago. Not surprising. The biggest sort of area of this is in China. There are huge device manufacturers in Shenzhen and other areas. I think it's important to note that many of these are probably test devices, so it's not as bleak as maybe it could be, but many of these are things that you wouldn't necessarily want connected to the World Wide Web. Cameras, industrial sensors, things like that. You can kind of, you can do this on your own, Shodan. You get a certain number of free searches, but it's really, really interesting to kind of look around and see what is on the public internet. Unencrypted, sometimes no username and password. It can be kind of terrifying. And Shodan's great, don't get me wrong. I like Shodan a lot, but I am cheap and I don't want to pay full price for a subscription. My manager said no. So I got to thinking after, I exhausted my, I don't know how many it is, free Shodan search limits. And I said, well, I'd really like to do some more scanning, but I'm out of Shodan search credits, so surely there's got to be a way to do this with another tool. And at first I looked into Nmap, which is great, but unfortunately not really great for scanning a large portion of IPs. And then I found this tool called Masscan. Masscan is like Nmap on steroids. It's fantastic. It uses basically the same Inmap syntax, but it can scan legitimately the entire internet. It's really fast. I found it to be really reliable. I've had a lot of fun with this tool. I highly, highly recommend that you go download it and play with it. Um, Here's the link to the GitHub. If you've used Inmap at all in the past, this tool will be really familiar to you. It allows you to scan on any port for any protocol. It has a bunch of other features that I won't go into, but super recommend you throw it on your lab and check it out. This is the portion of the program where I am obliged to give you a good faith warning. Just because you can scan the entire internet doesn't mean you should. I got a lot of flack the last time I gave this talk because people go, I scan anything I want to scan. And that is absolutely your right. However, you should know that in many jurisdictions, that is not entirely legal. Depending on your licensure and certifications, it's not entirely ethical within the terms of certification boards. So, please only scan things that you are authorized to scan. Remember that certain parts of the internet, like say election systems, don't really react well to being scanned and can unfortunately, especially in the latest climate, get you a visit from folks that you definitely do not want to talk to. But hypothetically, if you worked for a huge company with a huge presence that owned maybe half the IP space in the world, Masscan would be a great tool because you have a lot of space to roam. So this is, I just grabbed a screen capture off of my box. So I started Masscan up, randomized the hosts. I started doing a stealth scan, 2 ports, basically 1883, which is the MQTT unencrypted port, and then 8883, which is the MQTT over SSL port. You'll notice this number here is not 65,000 because apparently when subnetting, typos make a really big difference. And sometimes if you make a typo, instead of scanning 65,000 hosts, you end up scanning around 16 million hosts. So yeah, that happened, but shame on me. That should not have happened. So I did get a lot of really interesting um, hits back. Probably not places that I should have been looking, but stuff happens. So of the 16 million, I only got 225,000 hosts that squawked back to me on those ports, which isn't a lot, but I mean, it's a pretty significant amount. It means they at least have that port open. And of those, open ports, if you go all the way down, you'll see that I got about 1,000 hosts that were replying back on MQTT port 1883, which means they weren't using any kind of encryption. It was completely in the clear. I tend to find that if you haven't bothered to enable encryption, you probably haven't bothered to enable username and password off. It's probably a default configuration thrown out to the wild. So those are the hosts that are really vulnerable, and those are the hosts that I want to go after if I'm doing a scan, especially if I'm sort of going for the lower hanging fruit. So what I was able to do is write a script using PAHO MQTT to find connectable hosts within that scanned list that allowed a connection code of 0. Now, there's some other stuff you can do with the other connection codes, and that's definitely worthwhile, but I had a limited time to do this and a limited sort of scope. So I wanted to make sure I focused on things that were easy to find, easy to exploit. So I'm going for connection code 0 because that means that I connected with no username, no password, no encryption, which is, for my purposes, really good. So now I've got this list that'll allow me to connect, and I could have stayed in PAHO MQTT and sort of fiddled about with it to see what I could find. But I actually stumbled on this great tool from Akamai called MQTT Pwn, and it has the most awesome set of sort of pre-configured, almost Metasploit-like modules that allow you to do everything from credential brute forcing to topic enumeration to client reconnaissance. It's an awesome package, highly recommend it. It comes in its own Docker container. It's fantastic. So I was able to use that, and I connected to just a few of the things that I had found, the ones that looked interesting. And this is just a snapshot. It goes on for quite a ways. I didn't want to show anything terribly obvious or terribly insecure because I didn't want to sort of name and shame these folks. But you can see that I was able to connect to the sysbroker, and basically there's a bunch of topics that I can subscribe to underneath the sysbroker. It allows me to access a lot of information on this particular MQTT broker with no username, no password, no encryption. So that, if you think of the use cases we spoke about earlier, imagine I am a car manufacturer that now has MQTT exposed to the web, and suddenly I can connect to your car and tell it to turn off because it's out of fuel, or tell it to pull into a maintenance station because its oil is too dirty. There's a lot of really interesting things that you can think of as you go down this. Now, at the risk of sounding hyperbolic, I want to point out that most implementations you'll see of MQTT in more advanced sort of scenarios, like the connected car, like the connected factory, aren't default out of the box, no username, no encryption sort of scenarios. So I don't want it to seem like it's really super easy to go take over a bunch of cars. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying, though, that there are many, especially legacy factories or legacy implementations of this protocol that simply aren't secured, and somebody somewhere put them on the internet and then forgot about them. So I think if you dig, you'll find some really interesting use cases for this. All right. So we've talked a lot about what MQTT is and sort of the vulnerabilities and issues with it. We've found a bunch of MQTT brokers that are out on the internet with no username, no password, no encryption. And I could talk to you today about the power plants that run MQTT and how terrible it would be to take those over, or the wind turbines that run MQTT and how awful it would be if one of those got taken over or broken or taken offline. But I really want to focus today on something that I think you'll find even more interesting and even more important. Friends, I would like to introduce you to the Internet of Cows. Remember when I said earlier that IoT is exploding? There is so much technology that is in the Internet of Things, it's almost impossible to keep track of it. Well, we've connected cows to the Internet. We've connected sensors in their stomachs and sensors in their tails and sensors in their collars that allow us to drive them from remote offices. It's kind of crazy if you think about how connected something like the average cow is. Now, imagine, and this is an actual scenario, there's an actual product that does this. imagine you have a scenario with a bunch of free-range cattle that have collars that allow you to geofence them, tell them when to come back to the barn, tell them where they can roam. They shock them as they go too far outside the geofencing coordinates. Now imagine if I was able to take over that MQTT broker in the middle, and I could shock the cows and I could drive them into other places that were not in the geofence. I could have them break out of their pens and run down pedestrians. So imagine, if you will, the internet of zombie cows, and I think you'll start to see the really interesting use cases that can evolve from MQTT that is not properly installed and properly secured. The good news is much of this is moving to the cloud. As everyone knows, if it's in the cloud, it's awesome. The good news is that with that migration, a lot of default security things are becoming commonplace, like TLS, SSL. Most of the cloud vendors won't allow you to use no-auth. You have to use TLS for the majority of cloud vendors. There's some that still allow username and password. There's also a lot more detection and automation behind the behavior. So in the scenario like I talked about earlier, if I suddenly have a bunch of cows that are sending a lot more data than they used to, I can have a detection and anomaly service behind the broker that goes, that's not quite right. Maybe we should look into that. There's also a lot better implementations of TLS and SSL, specifically designed for IoT use cases. So you have entire teams of engineers working on making TLS lighter weight and faster and lower overhead, specifically for these constrained devices. It's also easier because many of the cloud providers allow you to integrate into their existing identity providers, making those per device policies that we talked about so much easier. For those of us who've been around a little while, I think you'll notice that the cloud is just another person's server. So while there's many good things about moving to the cloud, there are some downsides. Typically, cloud providers want to make it as easy as possible for people to onboard to their cloud service provider. So they make the environment highly customizable, which means that users can onboard to the cloud, but they can also do some really stupid stuff now with the power and scale of the cloud. More devices are connecting to a cloud service provider versus being segmented into their own networks, and with any connection, there's the potential for interception or breakage. It's just expanding that threat footprint even further. Systems also often aren't designed with the appropriate redundancy, so you have to keep in mind that many of these IoT device manufacturers or factories are used to sort of being on their own and off sort of in their own physical space, where everybody in their network was trusted because you had physical barriers that separated them. Many times when they move to the cloud, they forget to do a lot of the redundancy steps you'd see in a more traditional IT environment. All right, so that is pretty much everything on MQTT. Just some takeaways. So it's a lightweight, widely adopted protocol for IoT messages that uses publish and subscribe. It's often insecure, it's often misconfigured, and it's pretty much everywhere you look. After this presentation, I guarantee you're going to start to see it everywhere. By default, it has no authentication, and even with authentication, it doesn't support native encryption. When deploying, you have to utilize either encryption over the wire or on the device to protect things like username and password and digital certificates. And it's also really important but really hard to have tightly controlled per device certificates and per device ACLs. So that's many of the areas where you'll find that you can get a foothold is by compromising a device and stealing the certificate, or compromising a device and being able to impersonate another device or impersonate an authorized device. Thank you so much for taking an hour out of your Saturday to come and learn about IoT with me. For those of you who know me, you'll know that I'm a bit new to the IoT space, so I'm really excited to start sharing everything I'm learning with folks who may not have been exposed to it. I know that until probably 6 months ago, I hadn't been exposed to a lot of this, so I'm super excited about it. I hope you will be too. At the top is my very neglected website that I keep meaning to actually do something with. It's basically got the slides of my talks and that's it. But someday I'm going to write something amazing. It's just today is not that day. But check it out. All the slides will be uploaded there. That's the link to Masscan and MQTT Pwn, both freely available. Highly recommend you check them out. Super awesome tools. And then the last link is if you want to play with this at home, you can roll your own MQTT broker and kind of see how to configure it and how to attack it. The Instructables link at the bottom has a way to do that on your own. I think it's a really, really well written tutorial. It helped me a lot when I was getting some of my IoT stuff off the ground. Love it if you follow me on Twitter. I post somewhat about IoT and mostly about other things, but if those of you who know me, I worked at Twitter for a brief period, so now I guess I'm addicted to the platform and I have to stay there. So I will hang out afterwards for any questions. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter or find me at the cons whenever we get back to real life. Thanks so much and have a good weekend.